I Vow to Thee, My Country is one of our greatest national songs, heard regularly at royal events throughout the 20th century. It was sung at St Paul's Cathedral for the Silver Jubilee of George V. Lady Diana Spencer said that it was one of her favourite hymns from childhood and requested it be sung here again at her wedding to Prince Charles. 16 years later, it was performed at her funeral.
The music by Gustav Holst marries an imperial sweep and grandeur with that kind of catch-in-the-throat quality so characteristic of the best of English music, with its all-pervasive nostalgia.
The words fuse a love of country with the love of God, qualities which, as I have explored in the course of this series, have been the inspiration for much of the best British music.
Most remarkably of all, though it seems so much part of the national fabric, I Vow to Thee, My Country dates from only 1921.
But then, Elgar's Hope and Glory is only 20 years older, while the Royal House of Windsor itself was only created in 1917.
In other words, the 20th century is not a dying fall in the history of either the British monarchy or its music. Instead, it's a period of triumphant revival in which crown and nation find a new unity, a new language, and, above all, a new music.
Early in the 19th century, Britain's monarchy was set on a very different course. British music was in the doldrums. The Brighton Pavilion is a vision of the path both might have gone down. It was built by the Prince Regent, who became King George IV. Gluttonous, lascivious and extravagant, George destroyed public respect for the monarchy. At the heart of his personal pleasure palace, however, we can see another side of his character. This is his music room. Sometimes the king's fine singing voice would be accompanied by this magnificent organ. At other times he played the cello rather well, and most frequently he listened to his private military band, described as the best in Europe.
George's most famous musical guest at the Royal Pavilion was Giacomo Rossini, the Italian opera composer. The two men, equally vulgar in their way, got on famously. George brought Rossini here into the music room and introduced him to members of his band. The band, in Rossini's honour, played Rossini's own overture to The Thieving Magpie. Snobbish, aristocratic members of the house party were disapproving of Rossini's appearance, describing him as a fat, sallow squab of a man, and they were outraged at his easy familiarity with the king. He even dared to sit next to him. But George was entranced, and on Rossini's subsequent visits to London, the two sang duets together.
It was, however, a world away from the systematic royal patronage which produced the best English music of the past. The sacred works of the likes of Tallis, Bird and Gibbons. Rossini wrote fashionable light entertainments and made only fleeting visits to these shores. The last truly great English musician, Henry Purcell, had died over a century before. However well drilled George's band, no new British music of note emanated from his palaces or his reign.
Music at the Royal Pavilion had become the private passion of a royal sybarite. Much like the monarchy, in fact, which, decadent, mismanaged, and without visible point or purpose, seemed to be heading for irrelevance or worse. In France, the revolutionaries had cut off the king's head and abolished the monarchy. In America, former British colonial subjects were engaged in the novel experiment of a kingless republic, whilst here in Britain there were riots, conspiracies, and clamorous calls for reform. If it were to survive, the monarchy would have to do better than George IV. But what would the model of a modern, cleaned-up monarchy look like? And what would its music be?
These questions would be settled in the reign of George's niece, Victoria. And the monarchy's saviour was the man she married, Prince Albert. This is one of Albert's own compositions, played in the white drawing room of Buckingham Palace. On a piano, Victoria and Albert walk together. Albert gave this music to Victoria as an engagement gift in a collection of his work called Lieder und Romanzen, Songs and Ballads.
Victoria and Albert would make music together, sometimes take it in turns to sing to each other, sometimes singing duets. Theirs was a passionate relationship, and sharing these moments of intense music making only deepened it.
David Owen Norris is a pianist and composer who has studied the Prince Consort's music.
With a perfect dying fall. This splendid instrument is perfect for those sympathetic little duets.
Well, and these accompaniments,
Yes.
the accompaniments like in the song that we've just heard, when you need to have this sort of...
The lilt.
And you can lay down a sort of a bed of sound for the singer to relax upon.
And the decorations, this is very much Albertine, isn't it?
Well, it's ridiculous, isn't it?
Well, it's frankly hideous, like most of the things they bought.
It's this androgynous figure in the middle. It's very difficult to keep your eyes off it while you're playing. But they loved this decoration so much that actually they took it off an earlier piano and reapplied it.
Albert, of course, isn't only a consumer of music, he's not only a performer of music, he is actually a composer. How serious? I mean, how good?
Well, good, actually. I mean, I think he took it very seriously, and he was interested in the new innovations that particularly German early Romantic music was doing. And he was able to do some of the remarkable harmonic things. So there's a lovely surprise here which he waits to spring on a new page, which is rather lovely. But we've had an E-flat chord, and then it suddenly goes... Wow. And the way that he gets
Very
out of that...
Well,
very romantic.
Yes.
And he's very keen on doing that. And in general, I think he was very good. The other song that I've got here, Der Ungeliebte, the Unbeloved, has a marvellous introduction which conjures up that sort of, oh, I don't know, Weber opera sort of mood in a way that...
Lonely and deserted, and remote in both the musical sense and
he could do that. He could do that.
Albert himself was modest about his musical abilities.
I consider that persons in our position of life can never be distinguished artists. We have too many other duties to perform. Our business is not so much to create as to learn to understand and appreciate the work of others.
His insight led him to champion composers from Bach to Schubert, and he shared this excellent taste first with his besotted queen, eventually the nation.
Albert's taste in music was more serious than anything Victoria had been used to hitherto. But then, Albert was a serious man. There's a yearning, not only in music, but in the rest of his life, public and private, for something deeper, more earnest, even more sacred than the light, bright, drawing-room entertainment of Victoria's youth. Albert brought a new sense of moral purpose and drive to the British monarchy.
Another of Albert's enthusiasms, which Victoria duly learned to share, was for the music of Felix Mendelssohn. In 1842, the composer was invited for dinner at Buckingham Palace, the first of several visits. Mendelssohn described it as
the only nice, comfortable house in England.
All three would make music together, Albert pulling the stops out of the Buckingham Palace organ for Felix, Victoria singing Mendelssohn's songs much to his approval.
Really quite faultlessly, with much feeling and expression.
As a gift, Mendelssohn rearranged some of his famous songs without words, especially for the royal couple, so that both could play side by side at the piano. Victoria was given the easier part. Such domestic pleasures could be viewed as not so far removed from the lives of middle-class families who also gathered round their parlour pianos at this time. The monarchy had regained at least some bourgeois respectability by the mid-19th century. And the royal couple's moral rectitude was demonstrated again when they attended the musical sensation of 1847. This is from one of Mendelssohn's English-language oratorios. The Queen and the Prince Consort were deeply impressed when they attended one of the very first performances. Afterwards, Albert sent the composer a handwritten note of congratulation.
To the noble artist who, like a second Elijah, has freed our ear from the chaos of mindless jingling of tones, in grateful recollection, Albert.
Elijah marked out Mendelssohn as the natural successor to Handel, whose English-language oratorios remained wildly popular in Britain. The Hanoverian monarchy had found another German composer who spoke of Britain's spiritual destiny. Elijah would go on to be performed with fervent regularity at cathedrals, where huge choirs, orchestra and crowds of spectators gathered in the ancient naves. The Victorian church was rebuilding its musical infrastructure, which in time would serve the monarchy as well. But the first pioneers of Victorian musical greatness didn't live to see their visions realised. Barely a year after Elijah's premiere, Mendelssohn died, aged just 38. Among the causes were overwork and nervous exhaustion, as they were for Albert, who also died shockingly young at 42 in 1861. His loss was felt keenly, not just by Queen Victoria, but also, in time, by the nation. When it came to music, he'd clearly left unfinished business, as a closer examination of his monument here in Hyde Park indicates.
frieze of the Albert Memorial shows in sculptural form the Valhalla of cultural achievement as it was seen by the High Victorians. Now, Brits are hardly underrepresented. After all, Albert was the great patron of the arts and sciences in Victorian Britain. But when it comes to British composers, as the dress alone tells you, they belong to the 16th, the 17th, just to the 18th, and with a single 19th century figure, the justly forgotten Sir Henry Rowley Bishop. Forgotten, that is, apart from the wonderfully schmaltzy tune that he wrote to the even more schmaltzy words of Home, Sweet Home.
But with Albert dead and Victoria having begun her long withdrawal from public life to mourn him, who would lead a campaign to improve this sorry state of affairs? The answer turned out still to be Albert, now from beyond the grave. His ideas survived him, as did the profits from the Great Exhibition, which he championed in 1851. This financial legacy was spent in ways that changed the course of British music and culture. Some of it helped build the Albert Hall, state-of-the-art when it opened, and still central to Britain's musical life. And just behind it rose an even more important institution, one that gave Britain a new musical voice and trained great British composers from Gustav Holst to Benjamin Britten and beyond. The Royal College of Music was the direct result of fundraising by Victoria's children, including the future Edward VII, then known as Albert, Prince of Wales.
In his opening speech at the Royal College of Music, Edward quoted approvingly the dictum that music is the only sensual pleasure to which excess cannot be injurious. Quite how anybody, including his wife, kept a straight face is beyond me, for Edward was an expert in excess. His sexual appetites led to his being called Edward the Caresser, whilst his gluttony and corpulence gave him the nickname of Tum-Tum. With intellectual pursuits, however, it was quite another matter. He never picked up a book, and he never bought a decent picture. Even music, which he genuinely liked, was acceptable only in small doses. One act at the opera was usually quite enough, unless the leading lady were very, very attractive.
The prince was deadly serious, however, about the new college's duty.
The object is inspiring in every part of the empire those emotions of patriotism which national music is calculated so powerfully to evoke.
The Royal College of Music was born from a self-conscious attempt to re-establish an English national music, to go behind Handel, to reconnect English music with its glorious past, and to enable it to stand alongside its continental peers in Germany, Italy, and France. There was even talk of an English musical renaissance with the teachers and pupils of the Royal College of Music here in the Van. The last time there'd been anything like it was in the 16th and 17th centuries, when the Chapel Royal was the focus of a thriving English musical life and home to geniuses like Tallis, Bird, and Purcell.
The connections between college and the chapel went beyond their royal name. This piece exudes all the elaborate polyphonic majesty of the golden age of Elizabethan church music. But it was written in the 1890s by one of the Royal College's founding tutors, Charles Villiers Stanford, who had spent formative years as both a chapel organist and a choir conductor. His music was inspired by the great religious revival of the era and would in turn further fuel it. In the 19th century, the church was transformed by taking the Protestant Church of England back to its Catholic roots. It was called the Oxford Movement. Today, we'd probably call it High Church. So, once more, churches were built in flamboyant, colourful Gothic like this. They were filled with stained glass and images. The clergy wore lavish vestments. Elaborate rituals were reintroduced, and church music and choirs were revived in all their splendour. One person, however, resisted these changes. Victoria was the low church figure she'd been since childhood. She also remained largely withdrawn from public life, mourning her beloved Albert decades after his death. However, if the so-called Widow of Windsor wouldn't go to the new religion and new music, it would nonetheless come to her, here in St. George's Chapel. In 1882, the post of chief organist here was taken up by Walter Parrott, who was also the inaugural professor of organ at the Royal College of Music. Parrott's name isn't as well known today as some of his colleagues, because few of his compositions have endured, though this piece is still performed at least 4 times a year at St. George's, Windsor. While serving as a church organist in Huddersfield and Wigan, Parrott experienced the full ceremonial majesty of the High Church movement. Now he was able to share that experience with Her Majesty.
When Parrott arrived here, the royal musical diet was rather restricted. Mendelssohn's Hear My Prayer, that beautiful cliché of high Victorian piety, was performed 18 times in 1 year, whilst the same anthem was also performed twice in 1 week. Parrott embarked on a vigorous programme of reform. He rebuilt the organ in the private chapel, whose bellows had been gnawed by rats. He retrained the choir, and he greatly broadened its repertory. Parrott added pieces by his colleagues at the Royal College of Music like Parry and Stanford, together with masterpieces by earlier royal composers like Tallis and Purcell, which had been neglected for centuries. Thanks to Parrott, St. George's set new standards in music making, exposing Victoria and her family to the breadth of the English musical renaissance and to its deep roots.
Parrott went on to become the Queen's private organist as well. He would sometimes be summoned to play for Victoria alone. After so many lonely years in mourning, music was a solace and a comfort, and she would listen for hours at a time.
On Queen Victoria's 80th birthday, Parrott arranged for her to be greeted by an aubade, or morning concert, performed on the terrace of Windsor Castle. It included works by Sir Arthur Sullivan, Parrott himself, and a certain up-and-coming fellow northerner, Elgar. In gratitude, Victoria sent him a gift, this splendid baton. It's diamond-encrusted, it's got her monogram, VR, in enamel, and surmounted by the Imperial crown.
And just as the High Church approach to music revived royal worship, its love of ritual would help reinvent royal ceremony. This was the official hymn written for Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897. The music's by Sir Arthur Sullivan. It was sung at every church across England and Wales to mark the occasion, and the words refer specifically to the Queen. The whole nation singing as one an anthem for the Queen. For the first time in 2 centuries, music was unapologetically proclaiming the quasi-divinity of monarchy. On June the 22nd, St. Paul's Cathedral, rarely used for royal occasions since the reign of Queen Anne nearly 2 centuries earlier, was the setting for what the Morning Post called
the central ceremonial act of thanksgiving and rejoicing over the longest and happiest reign in history.
The Queen had processed through London in a deliberate revival of the great public pageants mounted by Tudor and Stuart monarchs, reinvented for the beginning of the age of the movie camera.
When Victoria arrived at St. Paul's, she didn't go inside. She didn't even get out of her carriage, as the effort it had been decided was simply too great. Instead, the Queen sat there as massed choirs arranged on the steps here sang to her.
Among the 500 singers were all the leading composers of the day, including Walter Parrott and Hubert Parry. Accompanying them were a full orchestra and 2 military bands. It's a long, long way from the decadence of George IV's private music parties at the Brighton Pavilion 70-odd years before. The monarchy had not only won back popular support, it was now conducting itself in the most public way imaginable.
One of her sniffy continental relatives was shocked that the Queen had given thanks to God in the street. In fact, if Victoria had had her way, the Jubilee wouldn't have been celebrated at all.
Throughout her reign, the Queen objected to ostentatious pomp as quite unsuitable to and incompatible with the present day. Only occasionally and reluctantly could Victoria be persuaded by ministers and other advisers of the value of public ceremony. Her people turned out in vast numbers again in 1901, when the Queen finally bade farewell to her empire. For the first time in over 60 years, Britain had a new monarch, Edward VII. And for the first time in most people's memory, a coronation would be held. But what form should it take in the 20th century, and what would it sound like? Edward's first instinct was to be radical. He even toyed with the idea of including a newfangled motor carriage in the coronation procession. But he was soon persuaded down a very different path.
Shrewd politicians had understood, and Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee celebrations had confirmed that Britain's fledgling democracy had a healthy appetite for royal ceremony. Churchmen, too, thanks to the Oxford movement, had rediscovered religious ritual, and they were learning to perform it on an ever grander and more effective scale. The result was that Edward's coronation was presented as the embodiment and the culmination of 1,000 years of royal history, which suited Edward perfectly, since, unlike his mother, he really enjoyed public ceremony and he adored dressing up.
The music too sought to emphasise royal tradition. The only permanent musical fixture at previous coronations had been Handel's setting of Zadok the priest. 1902, however, established the historical canon of royal classics, which we now expect to hear at royal occasions. The musical conductor-in-chief was Frederick Bridge, yet another Royal College of Music figure. He included works by the greatest English composers from the previous 5 centuries. He revived, for instance, a 17th century Amen by Orlando Gibbons, which would go on to be sung at every coronation of the 20th century. Alongside the greats of the past were new works by contemporary composers, amongst them Hubert Parry, the head of the Royal College of Music. He set the traditional text, "I was glad."
Jeremy, we're looking here at Parry's actual autograph score that was used in the Abbey itself.
That's right, yes.
Now, this is actually the piece of music that opens the whole coronation service, covering the entry of the King and the Queen and their great procession as they sweep up from the west doors. Can you explain how this piece works?
Well, the piece began with an orchestral introduction, which largely featured trumpets. And the idea of a fanfare really built into the music at the beginning.
So that, in other words, the king is actually coming through the doors. There's no need just to have trumpeters going tootle, tootle, too. He's written it.
He's written
It's
it.
the ballet.
It's an integral part of the piece.
And every movement in the coronation was to be orchestrated, was to be accompanied by music.
The Westminster Abbey Choir are down at the west door, and they were given the first words, "I was glad."
The choir then face the king and then turn
Yes.
and begin moving up the
Indeed,
Abbey.
indeed. I think the idea is it is, in a way, a march.
Yeah.
I think that Parry conceived it that way. And then you have this antiphony between the Abbey choir on the one sense, and this is answered by the general choir, or second choir. And it's building up to the first main climax, which, if we step over the page, here are tempo largamente.
Queen, followed by King, at this point are due to walk through the great choir screen of the Abbey and enter the choir itself, with in front of them the steps and the platform, the theatre on which they're going to be crowned. We turn over, heavens, it all stops. And it goes completely blank, and we've got the King's Scholars of Westminster School Vivat. Long live Regina Alexandria, long live the Queen, and then later on, long live the King. This, of course, is the moment that goes right back to the first coronation in the Abbey, which is William the Conqueror, where the people are all supposed to cry out, "Long live the King," Latin, "Vivat, vivat, vivat." This, again, has been turned into ballet, into music.
Absolutely.
Theatre.
And then we have this wonderful moment where we move into a brand new key. And this is undoubtedly to take us into another world.
On the word dolce.
Gently, yes, sweetly. And this is really to accompany this rather beautiful semi-chorus, or solo quartet, "Oh, pray for the peace of Jerusalem." This would have been a moment of great repose as they moved through and, you know, they prepared for prayer and so on. Much reduced
Imperial
orchestration.
pomp and circumstance cuts off.
Yes.
We remember now we're going to consecrate.
Yes.
And also swear oaths.
Indeed. And then it moves back into the march at this point.
It's actually marked,
Lento
isn't
alla
it?
marcia. And this is all really in preparation for the drama of the last chorus. He then takes us back to B flat for the last 2 or 3 pages of music, and for this top B flat, this piercing B flat.
It's hard to imagine a more majestic start to a religious service than Parry's music, which is why it's been revived at every coronation since and is still sung in churches across Britain to this day. And yet, Edward's crowning inspired another, still more iconic composition. It wasn't, however, written for the Abbey. The coronation was also celebrated by the Royal Opera House, where the new king was invited to be the guest of honour at a gala concert, with music written by a rather different Edward. Edward Elgar was the son of a shopkeeper, a self-taught musician and a Roman Catholic. That made him an outsider, compared to the Royal College of Music establishment. But Elgar understood public taste better than any native-born composer for centuries. Elgar was championed at court by Walter Parrot, who suggested the revival of a musical tradition, the Royal Ode. This was a form at which Purcell and Handel had once excelled, though they never wrote anything on this scale.
Rarely heard in its entirety today, Elgar's Coronation Ode was wildly popular when it was written, and it's not hard to see why. A sort of miniature oratorio in length, if not in forces, it's set for choir, soloists, and a huge orchestra. The mood veers wildly, bombastic, sentimental, bellicose, expansive. They're not very popular qualities today, but they pretty much sum up Edwardian England and the new king who gave his name to the age. If you had a hefty dose of melancholy, Also glimpsed in the music, you've got Elgar too. Elgar saw himself as a troubadour, giving voice to the spirit of the age, and above all, giving it tunes.
The court's pet poet, A.C. Benson, wrote most of the ode's words before Elgar started composing. But there was one point where the music definitely came before the text.
Gosh, man, I've got a tune in my head, Elgar wrote to his publisher at the beginning of 1901. Elgar recognised immediately that he was on to a winner. A damn fine popular tune that will knock 'em flat, as he put it. He made it the trio of his Pomp and Circumstance March No. 1, which, when it was premiered later in 1901, duly knocked 'em flat and received standing ovations and an unheard-of triple encore. But the tune was just too good not to use again. Later, Elgar liked to claim that it was King Edward who had come up with the idea. But, alas for the legend, this is impossible, as the two men hadn't yet met. Instead, it seems certain that it was Elgar himself who realised that the tune would make a magnificent finale to the Coronation Ode, and asked Benson to come up with words to match.
Elgar's music publishers immediately saw the commercial potential of this tune as a standalone song, but asked for new lyrics to give it still wider popular appeal. This is why Benson penned the most gloriously tub-thumpingly jingoistic of his verses. Land of Hope and Glory rapidly became our alternative national anthem, and it remains such a definitive statement of British national identity that few remember that it was created for a king. And it is not just the music of Edward VII's reign that has endured, so too has the elaborate ceremony and pageantry that he so much adored. George V's coronation just 9 years later followed the same template, but with even more music. Charles Villiers Stanford wrote this Gloria for the occasion, which went on to be revived in 1937 and 1953. Many years later, George V's son still recalled the power of the music.
In that gorgeous, glittering assemblage, listening to the fanfares of trumpets, the rich tones of the organ, and the voices of the choir, I became aware, as never before, of the true majesty and solemnity of kingship.
Yet George found his coronation a terrible ordeal. He hated public appearance almost as much as his grandmother, Queen Victoria. He even found that wearing the crown gave him a splitting headache.
Yet more strikingly, he was the first really unmusical monarch for generations. He enjoyed catchy tunes from No No Nanette, but thought that a Covent Garden performance of Beethoven's Fidelio was damn dull. And he drove the royalist Elgar to paroxysms of rage at the hopelessly and irredeemably vulgar quality of his court. So why did he go through with 5 whole hours of musical pageantry? Out of a sense of duty. He believed that his people wanted him to. Duty was a sort of talisman which drew the sting of royal splendour and reconciled it to an ever greyer, more democratic age. Ceremony ceased to be princely self-indulgence, as under George IV or Edward VII, and it became instead noble self-sacrifice, which bound the king in service to the nation as unremittingly as the factory hand to his work, the agricultural labourer to his toil, even the millions who made the ultimate sacrifice in the First World War. It was the anti-German feeling of the Great War which led George to rename the Hanoverian monarchy as the House of Windsor in 1917, the year after Hubert Parry had written that great hymn to England, Jerusalem. The composers of the English musical Renaissance were now writing for a veritable religion of nationhood, of which the monarch was both high priest and sacred head. The king recognised the moral value of Parry's song and, for the rest of his reign, heard it often at commemorations of the armistice and also at vast celebrations of empire. In 1935, for George V's Silver Jubilee, command performance was held in the Royal Albert Hall and broadcast across the empire via the BBC.
His Majesty, having in mind the values of the pursuit of music, has desired to encourage national music making in as comprehensive and representative a way as possible.
The BBC, founded in 1922, would, from this point on, play a major role in promoting both the music and the monarchy of Britain, broadcasting the monarch's annual Christmas speech, as well as a daily diet of British composers such as Elgar. And in 1937, it broadcast the coronation of the new king, George VI. For the first time, many millions of people could follow the ceremony live.
The Archbishop of Canterbury presents King George to the people.
Sir, I here present unto you King George, your undoubted king.
It was actually the BBC who commissioned one of the pieces which has endured from the occasion, William Walton's march, Crown Imperial.
Walton, like Elgar, was an outsider, an Oldham lad whose precocious musical talent had won him a scholarship to Oxford. Now he was writing for the biggest audience of his career, and his music rose to the occasion.
It's another one of these big tunes. It has lots of these big tunes.
He looked back at the tradition of the early part of the 20th century to Elgar, to Parry and others.
It's also sometimes perhaps cruelly described as film music, isn't it? And maybe the coronation of 37 now being thought of filmically rather than operatically.
Yes, I think there's certainly a visual element to Crown Imperial. One of the things that I think is so distinctively Walton is this rhythmic vibrancy, this energy. You know it's Walton immediately because of that rhythmic dynamism.
The monarchy had clearly adapted to the world of mass media and indeed mass democracy, and it had done so in part and paradoxically by embracing the tradition and the music of the past. When George was succeeded by his daughter, everyone, from the popular press to Winston Churchill, hailed the beginning of a new Elizabethan age. The Queen's 16th century namesake had presided over a golden age of music, so the 1953 coronation was the perfect opportunity to show the deep roots and enduring quality of British music. All the recent additions to the canon, such as Stanford and Parry, made their reappearance, along with new work by Walton again and Ralph Vaughan Williams. At this stage, the grand old man of English music, Vaughan Williams had spent the 20th century applying what he'd learned at the Royal College of Music.
Ralph Vaughan Williams was firmly on the left politically, and he was an assiduous collector of popular music in the form of folk songs. So, coming from this kind of background, he thought it a great weakness that previous coronations hadn't included a hymn for congregational singing. But when he suggested including one in 1953, he split opinion. The Musical Advisory Committee was not at all convinced. However, the Archbishop of Canterbury was enthusiastic, and the Queen herself thought well of the idea. This was decisive, and Vaughan Williams got his way with this democratic musical reform.
The result was heard at the moment when the Queen processed from her throne to the altar. It's a piece that has been sung in the Church of England since the age of the first Queen Elizabeth, the so-called Old Hundredth. The Scot, William Keith, wrote this translation of Psalm 100 in the 1550s. 400 years later, his words were still being sung to the tune that it was published with then. Some of the later verses are embellished by Vaughan Williams. Here he writes a trumpet descant, which adds an extra regal dignity, as well as echoing the fanfares traditional at such occasions. Vaughan Williams' own compositions often paid homage to the great Elizabethan composers. In his Abbey arrangement of the Old Hundredth, he paid tribute to another, John Dowland, who was the author of this beautiful harmony.
There was that sense of historical link and embracing of something to say, look, this is what we are, this is us, we are a musical nation.
"60 years have passed since the coronation of 1953, and already it seems a world away.
So much has changed in the intervening decades. Elizabeth, of course, still reigns over us to this day. But though music is still used to celebrate royal occasions, it no longer really serves to sanctify royalty. And yet, as I've argued throughout this series, it was the idea that monarchy has a sacred role and power which inspired the greatest of our music. In the reigns of Tudors and Stuarts, and through extraordinarily to the first decades of the 20th century, it was sacred monarchy which people fought over and prayed for and composed for. But do any of us really believe that monarchy still has such divine power?
Now, the sacred monarchy survives only in its music. But there at least it remains eternally, magnificently alive. It echoes from these ancient stones, awakens memories, and through the power of music, makes them live again.